September 5th, 1930. Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, Kansas. It was a Tuesday morning, cool for early September, the kind of flat Midwestern sky that gives nothing away. The execution was scheduled for dawn. The small assembly of witnesses, prison officials, a chaplain, the legally required observers, had gathered in the execution chamber and stood in the particular silence that gathers in rooms where this kind of thing is about to happen. The executioner was taking too long. Carl Panzram stood on the gallows with his hands bound behind him and his neck already in the noose. And he looked at the man, adjusting the rope and equipment with the careful, professional attention of someone who had done this before and was making sure everything was right. And Panzram said, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." Those were his last words. Not a prayer, not an apology, not a final statement about the injustice of his sentence or the darkness of his childhood or the decades of prisons and violence and accumulated wrong that had brought him to this particular room on this particular morning. Just impatience. Just contempt. Just a man who had spent 38 years in a state of permanent war with the entire human race, telling the person who was about to end his life that he wasn't moving fast enough. The trapdoor opened, and Carl Panzram was dead at 38 years old. He left behind a confession, 20,000 words written by hand in a prison cell, smuggled out page by page through the bars of his cell by a young guard named Henry Lesser, who had shown him, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, a small and entirely unearned act of human kindness. In that confession, Panzram described 21 murders committed across 2 continents. He described thousands of burglaries. He described arsons across multiple states. He described crimes that began when he was 11 years old and never stopped until the morning he stood on the gallows and complained that the executioner was too slow. "In my lifetime," he wrote, "I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all of these things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Not in the least bit sorry. 5 words. Written calmly in the same flat declarative register he used for everything. Not a boast exactly, not a confession in the sense of a weight being lifted. More like a statement of fact. The same tone a man might use to say the temperature outside or the distance to the next town. This is the story of Carl Panzram, a man the history books mostly forgot. A man who robbed a former president of the United States and used the stolen gun to kill sailors in New York Harbor. A man who bought a yacht with stolen money and turned it into a murder platform. A man who traveled to Africa, hired 6 local guides to take him crocodile hunting, and shot them all dead in the jungle and left their bodies to the river. A man who, at the end of it all, sat in a prison cell and wrote down everything he had done, in his own handwriting, without one word of regret. He wanted the world to understand exactly what it had made. "I have done as I was taught to do," he wrote. "I have no desire to reform. I have no desire to do good. The only desire I have is to do as I have done all my life, destroy and kill." He was not lying. Carl Panzram was born on June 28, 1891, on a farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota. A flat, cold, relentless stretch of land on the North Dakota border where the winters arrive early and stay until they feel like leaving and the work never ends. His parents were East Prussian immigrants, Johann and Matilda Panzram, part of the wave of German-speaking people who had come to the American Midwest in the latter decades of the 19th century in search of land and the possibility of a life that demanded less and returned more than the one they had left behind in Prussia. They had 7 children. Carl was the 6th. East Grand Forks in 1891 was a small settlement on the border of Minnesota and North Dakota, on the flat plain where the Red River ran between the two states. The winters there were among the harshest in the continental United States. Months of temperatures that drove everything indoors, storms that came off the Canadian plains without warning, cold that was not a season so much as a condition of existence that you adapted to or were destroyed by. Summers were brief and intense and required the extraction of everything possible from the land before the cold returned. The farm operated on the simple, brutal logic of survival. Everyone worked. There were no exceptions for age or weather or exhaustion. Carl and his siblings were in the fields before school and in the fields after school, and working through weekends and through the summers. Later, Carl would say he sometimes got 2 hours of sleep before he had to get up and start again. Carl Panzram was not a man who explained himself or asked twice. The punishment for not working was physical and immediate. Belt, strap, the back of the hand, whatever was close. This was not unusual for the time or the place. It was simply how things were. When Carl was about 8 years old, his father left. No dramatic departure, no explanation that made it into any record. Carl Panzram was there and then he wasn't, and 7 children and a wife and a farm that required constant labor to sustain were left to manage without him. Matilda was not, by any surviving account, a warm woman. She was competent and cold, and she kept the household running through sheer force of will and the labor of her children, including the labor of an 8-year-old boy who was now, in the absence of his father, expected to absorb more of the burden without complaint. Carl was not a compliant child. He had never been going to be. He had a quality that teachers and neighbors and family members all noticed and documented: a stubbornness, a refusal, something in his eyes when he was told to do something he didn't want to do that said, "I heard you, I am deciding." In a household that ran on absolute obedience and physical enforcement, this quality was not something that could be tolerated. It was beaten repeatedly with no visible result. He drank before he was 10. He was charged with being drunk and disorderly in juvenile court at the age of 8. The record exists. He stole food, coins, the ordinary theft of a hungry child who has decided that the rules about taking things were made by people who had enough and don't apply to people who don't. His teachers described him as difficult. His mother described him as impossible. The juvenile court records describe him as incorrigible. The legal term used at the time for a child who could not or would not conform to the expectations of the institutions he passed through. In 1903, when Carl was 11, he broke into a neighbor's farmhouse and took everything he could carry in his arms: cake, apples, and a revolver that someone had left on a shelf. He was arrested and brought before the court, and his mother sent him to the Minnesota State Training School. She was doing what mothers in her situation were supposed to do. There was a place for boys like Carl, and the place would sort him out. What it actually was, what Carl Panzram found inside it, was the event that organized everything that followed for the rest of his life. The Minnesota State Training School sat in Red Wing, a town along the Mississippi River south of St. Paul. It held approximately 300 boys between the ages of 10 and 20. From the outside, to the legislators who funded it, to the judges who sent children there, to the community that understood it as a place where troubled boys were set right, it looked like what it claimed to be. The boys called one room the paint shop. Not because anything was painted there, but because of what was left on the walls afterward. The bruises, the blood. Carl Panzram spent 2 years at Red Wing. In his autobiography, written decades later in a prison cell at Leavenworth, he described what happened there in specific, unsparing detail. He did not write about it the way a person writes about something they want sympathy for. He wrote about it the way a person writes about something they want documented. The specific room, the specific staff members, the specific patterns of abuse, offered not as an appeal to the reader's emotions, but as evidence. Staff members beat the boys with the calm efficiency of people who understood there would be no consequences. The facility had minimal outside oversight. Parents did not visit. The boys had no recourse and nowhere to go. What happened inside those walls stayed inside those walls by design. I was taught by Christians, Panzram wrote, how to be a hypocrite. And by men who were supposed to uphold the law, I was taught that might makes right. He burned the workshop down on July 7, 1905, built a crude firebomb and set it alight, and stood back and watched it burn. It was the first fire. It would not be the last. Over the course of his life, he would burn churches, buildings, an oil rig in Angola, a dozen structures across 2 continents, each fire a message written in smoke. I was here. I remember what you did. This is my response. He was 13 years old. He was released in 1906, returned briefly to his mother's house, and found it intolerable. The farm, the silence, the expectation that he would settle back into the life that had sent him to Red Wing in the first place. He got on a freight train heading west. He was 14 years old and had decided that moving was the only condition he could stand. On that train, in a lumber car somewhere in Montana, he encountered 4 older men, hobos, drifters, the transient workforce of the American West in the early years of the century. They were friendly at first, offered him food and warmth and company, and said they would take care of him. All 4 of them assaulted him. He wrote about this in his autobiography with the same flat register he used for everything. I cried, begged, and pleaded for mercy, pity, and sympathy, he wrote, but nothing I could say or do could stay them from their purpose. He survived. He got off the train. I was a human being when I got on that train, he wrote later. When I got off, I was something else. The something else that he became on that freight car in Montana, added to what had already been done to him at Red Wing, and before Red Wing, and in everything that had come before, that accumulated damage was now the organizing principle of his life. Not a wound to be healed, not something he wanted help with, a philosophy, a conclusion. The world was a place where the strong did whatever they wanted to the weak. He had been the weak. He was not going to be the weak anymore, and he was not going to pretend that the people who had been strong over him had done anything other than what they had done. The next decade and a half was a long, grinding accumulation of crimes and incarcerations and escapes and more crimes spread across a country that Panzram moved through like weather, arriving, causing damage, moving on before anyone could put together a complete picture of what had passed through. He was arrested in Montana for burglary in 1905 and sent to the state reform school there. He escaped. He committed more burglaries across the Pacific Northwest, sometimes traveling alone, and sometimes in the company of another young man named Jimmy Benson, who shared his general philosophy about other people's property and the institutions that tried to protect it. They robbed houses, stole from churches, burned the churches down afterward. Panzram had something specific about churches. They appeared throughout his autobiography, the targets of disproportionate destruction. The men who had beaten and abused him at Red Wing had called themselves Christians. The reform school had been operated under the auspices of organizations that spoke the language of redemption and practiced something else entirely. He burned the buildings that housed the language. He was arrested again, sent to another reform school, escaped from that one too. He was caught for a burglary in Oregon and sentenced to the Oregon State Training School. He escaped. He was caught again in Washington State. He escaped again. He moved east. He moved north. He moved wherever the freight trains went and wherever there was a lock he hadn't tried yet. At 15, he lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army. This was not an unusual strategy for boys of his era and background. The Army was one of the few institutions that would take you on the basis of what you said rather than what you could prove. The Army lasted less than 2 years. He stole from the supply stores. He was insubordinate with a consistency that made him remarkable even in an organization accustomed to difficult men. He was put in the stockade. He stole from the stockade. He was court-martialed. The officer who signed the court-martial order was William Howard Taft, then Secretary of War, in the middle of a political career that would take him to the White House in 1908. Carl Panzram filed the name away. He was 19 years old. He had a good memory for names. He was sent to Fort Leavenworth, the military prison in Kansas, a sprawling complex of stone buildings that had been housing military prisoners since the Civil War. Panzram spent 3 years there. What happened to him inside the military prison at Fort Leavenworth, he described in his autobiography with the same flat documentary register he brought to everything. The beatings were systematic and severe. The isolation was extended. The punishments available to military prisons in the first decade of the 20th century were extensive and applied with the same logic that had been applied to him at every institution he had ever passed through. Force, pain, degradation, the absolute authority of the people in charge over the people being managed. None of it produced the desired outcome. "When I left Leavenworth," he wrote, "all the good that may have been in me had been kicked and beaten out. I was so embittered and full of hatred that I wanted to destroy everything and everyone, most of all myself." He was 22 years old. He walked out of Fort Leavenworth in 1910 and began the decade that followed. Burglaries across California, Oregon, Washington, robberies in New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, arsons in a dozen states. He moved constantly, never staying in one city long enough for anyone to accumulate a complete picture of what he was doing and where he had been. He was arrested repeatedly, imprisoned repeatedly, escaped from prisons repeatedly. He picked locks. He cut through bars with tools he had manufactured or stolen. He talked his way through gates by presenting himself as someone other than who he was. He had learned, at institutions going back to Red Wing, that most people in authority respond to confidence and a plausible story. He was good at confidence. He was good at plausible stories. He was also good at violence when confidence and plausible stories stopped working. By 1920, he had served time at multiple state prisons, escaped from several of them, and committed crimes across a significant portion of the continental United States. He had not yet killed anyone, or had not yet killed anyone he was admitting to. He was 28 years old, and he had been in the system, in one form or another, for 17 years. Then he broke into a house in New Haven, Connecticut, and found out whose house it was. The house belonged to William Howard Taft, former President of the United States, the man who had been Secretary of War in 1907 when a 19-year-old Carl Panzram was court-martialed at the military barracks and sent to Fort Leavenworth. Taft had been president from 1909 to 1913, lost his re-election bid to Woodrow Wilson, and was now living quietly in New Haven while teaching law at Yale. He was a large, genial man, the heaviest president in American history, known for his good humor and his legal mind. He did not know that a 38-year-old man who had spent 20 years in prisons and reform schools had been carrying his name since 1907. Whether Panzram knew before he broke in that this particular house in New Haven belonged to Taft, whether he sought it out deliberately as an act of targeted revenge, or whether he discovered whose house it was during the burglary, the record is ambiguous. What the record establishes clearly is what he took, and what he thought about what he took: cash, bonds, jewelry, and Taft's personal .45 caliber automatic pistol, a service weapon, well-maintained, functional. "I was going to repay him for his kindness to me," Panzram wrote in his autobiography, in the passage about the burglary. The word kindness was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The court-martial, Fort Leavenworth. The 3 years of punishments that had completed what Red Wing had begun. This was what he had received from the man whose name was on the order. Kindness. He took the cash, he took the pistol, he left. He had a plan that had been forming for longer than the burglary. A plan that required money and a boat and the specific patient methodology that Panzram brought to everything he decided to do. With the money from the Taft robbery, he bought a yacht. He named it the Akista. He registered it under one of his many aliases. He fitted it out for extended use on the water. He sailed it south from Connecticut to New York Harbor, where the docks were busy and the bars near the waterfront stayed open late, and the working seamen of the merchant marine and the coastal shipping trade drank away their off hours in the particular way of men who spend most of their lives on boats and need something to do when they're not. Panzram understood bars. He had been in and out of them since he was a boy. He understood the social grammar of a room where men drank, who was alone, who was looking for company, who could be talked to and who wanted to be left alone. How to present himself as the right kind of person for the right kind of conversation. He went to the bars. He bought drinks. He introduced himself as a boat owner who needed a reliable hand for a short job. A day or two of work, good wages, nothing complicated. The bar was a long way from his real name and his real history, and the men who sat on the stools beside him were far from their own homes and far from anyone who knew them. And the offer was simple, and the man making it seemed trustworthy enough for a day's work. They came aboard the Akista. He got them drunk, methodically, generously, making sure the glass was always full. Then he shot them with the pistol he had taken from the former President of the United States. He dumped their bodies in Long Island Sound, near a lighthouse called Execution Rocks. He had read the name on a navigational chart and remembered it. He chose the location deliberately. He claimed 10 men killed this way. 10 sailors from the bars along the New York waterfront, each one lured aboard with the promise of work, each one left in the water that their families would never find them in. If the number is accurate, this alone would make the Akista one of the more productive murder platforms in American history. The Akista ran aground and sank near Atlantic City in late 1920. His last 2 intended victims escaped in the chaos of the grounding. The boat was gone. The money from the Taft robbery was mostly gone. Panzram was arrested in Stamford, Connecticut, shortly afterward on an unrelated burglary charge. He served 6 months. When he got out, he went to a shipping office and asked about passage to Africa. Because New York was familiar, because the boat was gone, because he had been everywhere in America that there was to go and done everything there was to do, and there were other places in the world and more things he hadn't tried yet, and because somewhere in his calculations, Africa was the next thing. Angola, 1921. Portuguese West Africa on the Atlantic coast, where the American oil companies were running exploratory operations and the port of Lobito Bay sat at the edge of the jungle on the Atlantic. Panzram got work as a foreman for the Sinclair Oil Company, which was drilling for petroleum in the region and needed men who could manage labor crews in difficult conditions. He was competent. He had always been competent at physical work. Decades of farms and prisons and outdoor labor had made him capable in ways that got him the job. He held it for several months, living in the fishing villages along the coast, working the rig, keeping to himself. He burned the rig down when he was done with it. Out of spite, he wrote. The word sat in the autobiography without further elaboration. Out of spite, as though it were a sufficient explanation, which for Carl Panzram it apparently was. He had been burning things down since Red Wing in 1905. The reflex had not diminished with time. Before that, while he was still working the coast, he killed an 11-year-old boy. He wrote about it in his autobiography in the same flat, documentary register he used for everything. What he did, how he did it. And then the sentence that has been in every account of his life since the manuscript was published. His brains were coming out of his ears when I left him, and he will never be any deader. He walked back to Lobito Bay, spent a few weeks there, began thinking about what came next. A few weeks later, he hired 6 local men to take him upriver in a canoe for a crocodile hunting trip. The animals were large in the Congo basin, and their skins brought money from European traders. The guides were experienced. This was ordinary work for them. There was nothing unusual about the request. They paddled into the jungle, 6 guides and 1 American with a Luger pistol. Panzram waited until they were deep enough into the bush that the sound wouldn't carry back to Lobito Bay. Then he shot all 6 of them. He threw the bodies overboard. He wrote that the crocodiles took care of the rest. He described this in the same tone as everything else, methodical, factual, the tone of a man who had planned something and executed it and was now recording the outcome. He rowed back to Lobito Bay alone. He knew dozens of people had seen him leave with 6 guides. He understood what that meant. He moved quickly, arranged passage on a ship, left Angola, and headed back to the United States. He had been in Africa for less than a year. He was leaving behind 7 dead people, in addition to the 10 sailors in Long Island Sound, and everything that had come before the Akista that he had mentioned in the autobiography, in varying degrees of detail. The arithmetic of Carl Panzram's life was a number that nobody had calculated while he was still alive, because the pieces were scattered across 20 years and 2 continents and a dozen jurisdictions that had no mechanism for connecting them. He existed in fragments. John O'Leary in Connecticut, Jeff Davis in Oregon, Jefferson Baldwin in Montana, Carl Panzram in a cell somewhere, a different alias in the next cell over. Each crime existed in isolation. Each conviction and each escape existed in isolation. Nobody had the complete picture. Nobody would have it until he wrote it down himself. He returned to the United States in 1922. He passed through Sing Sing, the maximum security prison on the Hudson River, one of the most famous prisons in the country, whose name had become synonymous with the extreme end of the American penal system. He passed through Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, in the far north of New York, near the Canadian border, where the winters drove the temperature far below 0, and the isolation was as complete as anything outside a military installation. He escaped. He was recaptured. He escaped again. The cycle had been running since he was 11 years old. It showed no sign of stopping. In 1928, he was arrested in Washington, D.C. on a burglary charge and sentenced to 25 years at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The warden there read the file. He called Panzram in for an intake interview. He looked at the man standing in front of him and said whatever wardens say in that situation. Panzram told him, "I'll kill the first man that bothers me." The warden took this seriously. He ordered strict supervision, restricted movement, close monitoring. On June 20th, 1929, Robert Wonk, the civilian foreman of the prison laundry, bothered him. What exactly constituted the provocation is not fully documented. Wonka managed the inmates who worked the laundry. He told them what to do, monitored their work, enforced the rules of the laundry operation. At some point during the workday, something happened. Panzram picked up an iron bar and beat Wonka to death. Then he went back to his station and waited for the guards. When they arrived, he explained what he had done. He had told the warden he would kill the first man who bothered him. This man had bothered him. He had done what he said he would do. He didn't find this complicated. At his trial, he admitted to everything. He admitted to 21 murders. He said he had no interest in defending himself against the charge of one more. He asked for the death penalty. He asked for it the same way he asked for everything, directly, without decoration, in terms that left no ambiguity about what he wanted and why. Anti-capital punishment organizations wrote to him asking for his cooperation. They wanted his case. He told them in writing that if they interfered with his execution, he would kill as many of them as he could reach before the authorities stopped him. Carl Menninger assessed him, declared him sane, competent, fully aware of what he had done. The execution was scheduled for September 5th, 1930. But before Leavenworth, before Wonka, before the gallows, there was the district jail, and there was Henry Lesser. Lesser had been working as a guard at the Washington, D.C. jail for less than a year when Panzram arrived in 1928 on the burglary charge. He was 26 years old. He had grown up in a working-class family in Massachusetts, dropped out of school early, worked in a clothing store, found his way into the prison system with the specific kind of idealism that survives just long enough for the institution to either convert it or destroy it. He believed that the men behind the bars were still human beings. He believed that prisons were doing something wrong. In that particular environment, at that particular moment in American corrections history, these were unusual beliefs. He noticed Panzram immediately. It would have been difficult not to. Panzram was physically large and projected something that was not quite aggression, but was adjacent to it. The settled, exhausted readiness of a man who has spent decades concluding that every interaction is a potential confrontation, and who has been right about this so many times that the conclusion has become as reflexive as breathing. He moved through the jail with the quality of weather, not threatening exactly, but making clear that anything in his path should consider getting out of it. Lesser watched him for a few days. Then, during his evening rounds, he passed $1 through the bars of Panzram's cell. No transaction, no strategy, just $1. Because this particular human being looked like he could use one, and Lesser was in a position to provide it, and nobody had told him he couldn't. Carl Panzram had been inside institutions of one kind or another since he was 11 years old. He had been beaten in most of them. He had been sexually abused in the first one. He had spent years in solitary confinement across multiple facilities. He had fought guards, organized escapes, made himself as expensive to manage as any human being in the American penal system. Nobody had ever just given him $1. He took it. He looked at Lesser. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then they began to talk. Slowly at first, during the late rounds when the jail was quiet, then more often. Lesser asked questions, not the questions that people in authority usually ask, not the questions that are really just demands for compliance dressed up as curiosity, but genuine questions. How does a person become this? What happened? What is the path from East Grand Forks, Minnesota, to a jail cell in Washington, D.C.? Panzram told him. Lesser listened without flinching, without the reflexive moral distancing that most people reach for when the story gets too uncomfortable, without the need to interrupt and redirect towards something more manageable. He encouraged Panzram to write it down. He provided paper and pencils. The arrangement they developed was conducted in the dark during the late-night rounds. When Panzram had written about 15 pages, he left them between the bars. When Lesser came by, 2 or 3 in the morning, the hour when a jail is as close to silent as it ever gets, he picked up the pages and left fresh paper. Neither of them discussed it during the day. It was a transaction between a man writing and a man carrying, and it went on for months. 20,000 words. Some accounts say more. The autobiography described everything. The farm in East Grand Forks, the father who left when Carl was 8, Red Wing and the paint shop, the freight car in Montana, Fort Leavenworth, the decade of escapes and prisons, the Akista, Angola, the crocodiles, And running through all of it, the argument, I have done as I was taught to do. I was taught by Christians how to be a hypocrite, and by men who were supposed to uphold the law, I was taught that might makes right. Everybody thought it was all right to deceive me, lie to me, and kick me around whenever they felt like it, and they felt like it pretty regular. When I left Leavenworth, all the good that may have been in me had been kicked and beaten out. I was so embittered and full of hatred that I wanted to destroy everything and everyone, most of all, myself. He was not confessing. He was not seeking absolution or understanding or mitigation. He was making an argument, cold, furious, internally consistent, about cause and effect, about what the system does to people when it decides they don't matter, about what walks back out when those people have nothing left to lose. He was not saying he was a victim. That word would have made him furious. He was saying something harder. I am the logical result of what you did. Follow the chain. Every link holds. Henry Lesser read those pages during his rounds in the dark and understood that he was holding something that the world needed to see, and that the world was not going to want to see it. He was right on both counts. He lost his job at the district jail when the manuscript was discovered. He kept the pages anyway. He protected them through his subsequent years as a parole officer, then a clothing salesman, through the Depression, through the war, through 40 years of letters to editors and criminologists and writers who read the pages and found them extraordinary and didn't know what to do with them. H.L. Mencken read them and called them remarkable. Nobody would print them. The book was finally published in 1970. Killer, a journal of murder, 40 years after the gallows at Leavenworth. It remains in print. The original manuscript sits in the special collections at San Diego State University. Panzram's handwriting. The pages pass through bars in the dark. The complete record of what America did to a boy from a farm on the North Dakota border and what that boy did in return. Panzram was transferred to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1928 to serve a 25-year sentence. The same prison in the same state where he had first been confined as a 19-year-old soldier. He told the warden on his first day what he intended to do. I'll kill the first man that bothers me. The warden did not take this as an idle statement. He had read Panzram's file, all of it, going back to Red Wing and Fort Leavenworth and the decade and a half of escapes and recaptures that followed. He knew who was standing in front of him. He ordered strict supervision, restricted movement, close observation. For several months this worked. Panzram was confined, monitored, given little opportunity to act on anything. He continued his correspondence with Henry Lesser, writing letters that were a mixture of practical observations about prison conditions and the kind of philosophical statements that had run through his autobiography, about the nature of the world, about what he had done and why, about the logic that governed everything he had ever decided. He was 37 years old. He had been in prisons for most of his life. He had been beaten, starved, shackled, placed in extended solitary confinement, subjected to every punishment available to American institutions across 4 decades. He had killed 21 people, or more. The autobiography was specific about some deaths and vague about others. He had committed crimes across 21 states and 2 continents, and he had told the warden what he intended to do. On June 20th, 1929, Robert Warnke, the civilian foreman of the prison laundry, crossed whatever line Panzram had drawn for him. The exact nature of the provocation is not fully documented. Warnke was the laundry foreman. He managed the inmates who worked the laundry, which was one of the prison's working assignments. At some point during the workday, something happened between Warnke and Panzram that Panzram decided constituted being bothered. Panzram attacked him with an iron bar. He beat him to death. Then he walked back to his workstation and waited. When guards came to investigate, Panzram was cooperative. He explained what he had done, and why in the same flat, direct way he explained everything. He had told the warden he would kill the first man who bothered him. Warnker had bothered him. He had kept his word. He did not consider this complicated. At his trial for the murder of Robert Wonk, Panzram was entirely cooperative with the prosecution. He admitted to the killing without reservation. He admitted to 21 murders total. He told the court he had no interest in defending himself against the charge of one more killing. He did not want a reduced charge. He did not want a life sentence. He asked for the death penalty. He asked for it with the same calm specificity he brought to every other decision in his life. He had decided this was what should happen, and he was prepared to advocate for it in court. Organizations campaigning against capital punishment contacted him. They saw in his case an opportunity, a man sentenced to die who could become an argument for abolition. They wrote letters. They sent representatives. They asked for his cooperation. His response was immediate and direct. He told them that if they interfered with his execution, he would kill as many of them as he could reach before the authorities stopped him. He wanted to die. He had asked to die. He did not want their help. He did not want to be used as an argument for anything. He did not want to be alive any longer than necessary, and he did not want anyone's philosophical position about capital punishment standing between him and that outcome. "I wish you all had one neck," he wrote to one such organization, "and that I had my hands on it." Carl Menninger was brought in to assess Panzram's mental competency, to determine whether he understood what he was doing and what the consequences were. Menninger was one of the most prominent psychiatrists in America, the founder of the Menninger Clinic in Kansas, a man who had thought deeply about the relationship between institutional violence and human psychology. He examined Panzram carefully. He declared him entirely sane, of sound mind at the time of the murder, fully competent to stand trial, fully competent to receive the sentence he had requested. The execution should proceed. It proceeded. September 5th, 1930. Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. It was a Tuesday morning. The execution chamber was prepared. The small assembly of required witnesses, prison officials, a chaplain, the legally mandated observers, stood in the particular silence of a room where something irreversible is about to happen. The executioner was taking too long with the adjustments. Carl Panzram stood on the gallows with his hands bound behind him and the noose already around his neck, and he looked at the man fussing with the rope and equipment and said, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." The trap door opened. He was 38 years old. He died as he had lived, impatient, contemptuous, saying exactly what he thought to whoever happened to be in the room. The last statement of a man who had decided a long time ago that the only freedom available to him was the freedom of absolute honesty about what he was and what he had done and how he felt about all of it. Not sorry. Not in the least bit sorry. Henry Lesser kept the pages. He carried them through the decades after Panzram's death, through his years as a parole officer, through his years as a clothing salesman, through the Depression and the war and the long post-war quiet when nobody wanted to publish a 20,000-word confession by a man who claimed 21 murders and expressed no regret about any of them. He wrote to editors. He wrote to criminologists. He wrote to H.L. Mencken, who found the manuscript extraordinary but impublishable. He kept writing. The book was published in 1970. Killer, a Journal of Murder. 40 years after the gallows at Leavenworth, the reviewers struggled with it. It didn't fit any category comfortably. It wasn't a confession in the ordinary sense. It wasn't asking for anything. It wasn't a memoir in the ordinary sense. It contained no nostalgia, no self-pity, no desire for the reader's sympathy. It was something harder to name. A document produced by a man who had concluded that the only thing nobody could take from him was the truth, and who had used that truth like a weapon aimed at everything and everyone. At the farm in Minnesota and the reform school in Red Wing and Fort Leavenworth and the American prison system that had processed him for 25 years and returned him to the world repeatedly, each time worse than before. Carl Menninger, who had declared him sane at the time of Wonka's murder and whose declaration had cleared the way for the execution, wrote later, "I think I'll end by saying that I consider Panzram's autobiography one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of American crime. He was, in my opinion, the product of the very system that executed him. The system that made him also executed him." That was the final argument. The original manuscript sits in the special collections at San Diego State University. Carl Panzram's handwriting. The pages that Henry Lesser smuggled out one night at a time through the bars of a cell in the District of Columbia jail in the dark on his rounds and kept for 40 years before anyone would print them. 40,000 words about what America did to a boy from a farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, and what that boy did in return. For all of it, not in the least bit sorry. There is a question that the case of Carl Panzram has been generating since Henry Lesser first smuggled those pages through the bars of the district jail, and that it continues to generate now that the pages are in an archive in San Diego and the book has been in print for 50 years. The question is not about what Panzram did. What he did is documented in his own handwriting, verified against available records, sitting in the special collections where anyone can read it. The question is about what produced him. Carl Menninger, a man who spent his professional life trying to understand the relationship between human beings and the institutions that shape them, called Panzram the logical product of the American prison system. This was not a statement about innocence. Menninger was not saying Panzram shouldn't have been executed, or that his crimes were excusable, or that the people he killed deserved less consideration because of what had been done to him. He was making a different, harder argument. That what Panzram became was not an accident. That it was the predictable result of a series of specific decisions made by a series of specific institutions, each of which had the opportunity to do something different and chose not to. Red Wing and the paint shop. Not an aberration in a system that was otherwise working well. A documented feature of an institution that housed 300 boys with no outside oversight and no accountability for what happened inside. Fort Leavenworth and the 3 years of punishment that followed a court-martial signed by a future president. The record of what was done to Panzram inside that facility is part of the same file as the court-martial order. The cycle of imprisonment and release, and more imprisonment and more release, each time returning someone to the world who was, by his own account and by every available measure, more damaged and more dangerous than when he went in. Every time I went to prison, I came out a worse man than when I went in, he wrote. He was not describing this as a complaint. He was not asking for sympathy. He was describing it as a factual observation about a process, the way an engineer might describe a machine that was not producing its stated output. The machine was not producing rehabilitation, it was producing Carl Panzram, and then in 1930, having produced him, it executed him. Menninger saw this as a conclusion to an argument. The system that made him also destroyed him. That was more devastating than anything Panzram himself had written, because it came from outside the rage and could not be dismissed as the self-justification of a violent man. The American prison system of the early 20th century was not designed primarily to rehabilitate. It was designed to punish and to contain. These are different functions, and the difference matters enormously when you trace what happens to a specific human being over decades of contact with that system. Punishment and containment, applied to a child from the age of 11 onward, with no interruption, no alternative, no period during which the child was treated as something worth treating with care, produces something, not unpredictably, not by accident. The something they produced in Carl Panzram's case was thoroughly documented in his own handwriting, in a manuscript that took 40 years to find a publisher because the argument it made was too uncomfortable to print. The argument was simple. What you do to a child, that child does to the world. You beat him, he learns that beating is the grammar of human interaction, and that the only question is, who is hitting and who is being hit? You abuse him in institutions that operate without oversight. He learns that authority is predatory, and that the appropriate relationship to power is either submission or the accumulation of enough force to reverse the equation. You cycle him through prisons that make him more dangerous with each pass through the system. You confirm every conclusion he had already reached about what the world is and what people are worth. And then he walks out, and he does what he was taught. 21 people died. Robert Warnke was beaten to death with an iron bar in a prison laundry. The sailors in Long Island Sound had families. The boy in Angola was 11 years old. The 6 men who paddled him into the jungle to hunt crocodiles had names nobody recorded. The mathematics of that suffering is real and permanent, and nothing in Panzram's autobiography changes it. But his autobiography is not asking to change it. It is asking something else. It is asking you to sit with the fact that the same country that produced Red Wing and Fort Leavenworth and the freight car in Montana, that processed a child through 2 decades of systematic violence and called it rehabilitation. That same country then executed the man it made and closed the file and moved on. "I have done as I was taught to do," he wrote. The autobiography is sitting in an archive in San Diego. Panzram's actual handwriting, the pages that Henry Lesser smuggled out one night at a time through the bars of a cell, folded and passed in the dark, and kept for 40 years because he believed the world needed to read them. 40 years before anyone would print them because the argument was too uncomfortable, because the argument held. Carl Panzram was born on June 28, 1891, on a farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, and he was dead before he was 40. And in between, he left behind the most honest document in the history of American crime, a confession that was also an indictment, written in the handwriting of a man who had decided that honesty was the only thing left that nobody could take from him. "I could not help the fact that I was what I am," he wrote. "No more than you could help being what you are." That is the line that stays with you. Not the murders, not the yacht, not the crocodiles. The fact that he looked at the people who would read his words decades after his death, people who had never been to a reform school in Minnesota, never been assaulted on a freight train in Montana, never spent 20 years being told by every institution they encountered that they were worthless, and said, "You and I are not so different. You were just luckier about where you started. What do you do with what you made?"